A human soldier was granted an alien companion. Their bond altered everything. Captain Jace Collins had seen it all. From the harsh battlefields of distant planets to the political schemes of intergalactic leaders, he had fought in countless wars and survived. The war on the planet Verles had been one of his most difficult assignments, and he was tired. The scars of his past, both physical and emotional, weighed heavily on his heart. But he was a soldier, and soldiers had a job to do. Verles was a desolate world, a planet where the scars of war were visible on every corner. The once thriving cities were now ruins, destroyed in the conflicts between the Valorian Empire and the Galatian Confederation. The air was thick with smoke, and the landscape was barren, with barely any signs of life. Jace sat alone in his small command room aboard the Titan-class ship, staring out into the endless expanse of space. His mission was clear: gather intelligence, sabotage enemy weapon caches, and return to base. But despite the mission's simplicity, something felt off. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more at play here, something he wasn't being told. His thoughts were interrupted by the sharp chime of his communicator. He sighed and reached for the console. The screen flickered to life, revealing the stern face of General Thorne, his commanding officer. "Captain Collins, we have a new assignment for you," General Thorne said, his voice cold and formal as always. "We've decided to assign you a companion for your upcoming mission. You'll be working alongside her, and I expect full cooperation." Jace raised an eyebrow. A companion. He had worked with teams before, but he was never one to rely on others. He had always preferred to work alone, to trust only himself. He opened his mouth to protest, but the general continued before he could speak. "This is not negotiable, Captain. She is an alien, and you'll need to rely on her abilities. Her psychic talents will be valuable in this operation," Thorne said, a hint of something unspoken in his tone. Jace frowned. Alien. He had heard of the Kyrians, a species known for their strange abilities, but he had never worked with one. He had always been wary of alien races, especially those with psychic powers. They could read minds, manipulate emotions, and even influence actions. Trusting one of them would be difficult. "Understood, sir," Jace replied, his voice steady despite the unease that crept up inside him. The transmission ended abruptly, and Jace was left to process the news. A Kyrian companion. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew one thing: this was going to be a challenge. Hours later, he was summoned to the hangar bay, where he was to meet his new companion. The massive doors slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a sleek, silver shuttle parked in the center of the room. The shuttle was elegant, far more advanced than the military vessels Jace was accustomed to, and its design reminded him of the Kyrian ships he had seen in reports. As Jace approached the shuttle, the hatch opened, and out stepped a figure. She was taller than most humans, her skin a shimmering shade of violet, and her hair flowed like liquid silver. Her eyes glowed softly, and her markings, intricate patterns of light and energy, covered her arms, pulsing with a faint rhythm. She was beautiful in a way that felt alien and unearthly. Jace stopped in his tracks, momentarily stunned by her appearance. She was everything he had imagined, and yet, she was more. There was a presence about her, a calmness that seemed to fill the space around her. "I am Tessa, your companion," she said, her voice smooth and melodic with a strange resonance. She offered him a slight bow, her movements graceful and precise. Jace didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to this kind of introduction. Most of the soldiers he had worked with had a much more direct approach, but Tessa didn't seem like most soldiers. She was a Kyrian, an alien, and that made everything feel different. "I'm Captain Collins," Jace said, forcing himself to remain composed. "I wasn't expecting this." Tessa smiled, but it wasn't a smile that Jace could fully understand. There was something in her expression, something almost knowing. "You're not the only one who's been assigned a new role, Captain." Jace nodded, still unsure of what to make of her. They were supposed to work together, but the idea of relying on someone or something he didn't fully trust was unsettling. He had been trained to depend on his instincts, to survive on his own. Having a partner was a foreign concept. They didn't speak much during the briefing. Jace tried to focus on the mission, as he always did, but his mind kept wandering back to the Kyrian standing beside him. He couldn't help but wonder what her abilities were, how she would react under pressure, and if he could truly trust her. When the mission began, the tension between them was palpable. Jace and Tessa were sent to infiltrate a Valorian stronghold deep within the jungle of Verles. The objective was simple: gather intelligence, sabotage key weapons caches, and disable enemy communications. But despite the simplicity of the mission, everything felt off. The terrain was treacherous, with dense foliage and constant rain. Jace's boots sank into the mud as he moved forward, his rifle held at the ready. Beside him, Tessa moved with a fluidity that was almost unnatural. She didn't seem to struggle with the conditions at all, her steps light and sure. They traveled in silence for hours, avoiding patrols and staying in the shadows. Jace kept his eyes on the path ahead, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that Tessa was always watching him, her violet eyes scanning the surroundings with a quiet intensity. She was more than just a companion. She was a presence, one that Jace couldn't ignore. Finally, they reached their objective, a heavily fortified compound deep within the jungle. The enemy soldiers were scattered across the perimeter, but with Tessa's help, they were able to slip past unnoticed. Her psychic abilities allowed her to sense the guards' movements, and she guided Jace through the maze of buildings without a sound. They entered the main building, where Jace planted the explosives that would disable the weapons cache. As he worked, Tessa stood guard, her senses attuned to every sound, every movement around them. And then it happened. Jace heard a faint noise, something wasn't right. Before he could react, he felt a sharp pressure in his mind, like a wave of energy crashing over him. It was Tessa. She had sensed something he hadn't. A group of Valorian soldiers had entered the building, and they were closing in. "Stay calm," Tessa whispered, her voice in Jace's mind. He hadn't expected the psychic link to be so strong, but it was there, clear and direct. "I can handle this." Jace felt a strange mix of fear and awe as he realized what was happening. Tessa wasn't just a companion, she was his equal. She was capable of sensing the enemy, of reading the battlefield in ways Jace couldn't even begin to comprehend. Without another word, Tessa moved, her body a blur of motion. She gestured, and the air around them seemed to shift, her psychic power weaving through the walls of the building. The soldiers never saw it coming. Jace stood frozen for a moment, his heart racing. He had never seen anything like this before. Tessa wasn't just helping him, she was changing the game. When the soldiers were dealt with, Jace couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel so alone. But as the mission continued, the unease that had settled in his chest grew. The bond between him and Tessa was undeniable, and yet it was something he couldn't fully understand. He didn't know if he could trust her, or if he could ever fully let his guard down. One thing was clear, though: this mission was only the beginning. Their bond was going to change everything. The days that followed were filled with danger, uncertainty, and a constant undercurrent of tension. Captain Jace Collins had always relied on his training, his instincts, and his ability to think on his feet. But working alongside Tessa, his Kyrian companion, was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The planet of Verles was not only a war zone, it was a hostile, unpredictable place. The air was thick with humidity, and the dense jungles seemed to close in on them with every step they took. Despite the challenging conditions, Tessa moved through the terrain with ease, her senses guiding them with an almost eerie precision. Her psychic abilities allowed her to sense danger before it even approached, and her every movement seemed deliberate, controlled, as though she were one with the jungle itself. Jace found himself increasingly aware of her presence. She wasn't just an ally, she was something else, something more. Her violet eyes were always scanning, always alert. Her glowing markings flickered softly in the dim light, almost like they were alive. There were moments when Jace could feel her mind brushing against his, subtle and gentle, and it made him uneasy. He wasn't used to being vulnerable in this way, especially with someone he barely knew. She could sense his thoughts, his fears, his doubts. It was both unsettling and oddly comforting. They had been tasked with gathering intelligence from a Valorian stronghold deep within the jungle. The compound was heavily guarded, and getting in would require more than just strength and skill. It would take trust, something Jace was not willing to give easily. He had always worked alone, trusting no one but himself, but Tessa was different. There was something about her, something that made him hesitate when he thought about pushing her away. Maybe it was the way she seemed to know exactly what he needed before he even spoke, or the way she could read the air, sensing things Jace couldn't see or hear. As they moved deeper into enemy territory, Jace began to realize that Tessa's abilities went far beyond what he had been told. She wasn't just a psychic, she was a force of nature. The way she could feel the slightest shift in the air, the way she could anticipate the enemy's movements before they even made a sound, left Jace in awe. It was as if she were able to tap into the very essence of the world around them. One evening, as they set up camp in a secluded part of the jungle, Jace sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle. The firelight flickered across his face, casting shadows that made him look older, more tired than he felt. He couldn't remember the last time he had a real conversation with anyone. It had always been mission after mission, battle after battle. But now, with Tessa sitting across from him, he felt a strange sense of calm. Her presence was a quiet one, but it was always there, like a constant hum in the back of his mind. "Jace," Tessa's voice broke through the silence, her tone soft but clear. "You're wondering why I'm here, aren't you?" Jace looked up from his rifle, meeting her gaze. She didn't look surprised. She knew he was thinking about it. That was the thing about her. She always seemed to know what was on his mind. "I'm not sure I understand what you're really capable of," Jace replied, his voice low, careful. "You've got these powers, these abilities, it's hard to wrap my head around it." Tessa smiled faintly, her violet eyes glowing in the firelight. "I understand," she said, her voice full of empathy. "I'm not here to make things harder for you. I'm here to help, Jace." "Just like you're here to help me." Jace felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't realized just how much he had been shutting her out. He had been focused on the mission, on survival, but he hadn't really stopped to consider Tessa's perspective. She wasn't just a tool to be used. She was a partner, a sentient being with her own thoughts, her own feelings. "I'm not used to trusting anyone," Jace admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Especially someone like you." Tessa didn't seem offended. Instead, she nodded slowly as if she understood. "I know. It's not easy to trust someone who can read your thoughts, who can feel your emotions. But you're not alone, Jace. You never have been." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Jace didn't know how to respond. He had been alone for so long that the idea of having someone by his side, someone who understood him in ways he couldn't explain, was foreign to him. But Tessa was right. He had never truly been alone, not with her. As the days passed, their bond grew stronger. It wasn't just the psychic connection that tied them together. It was the shared experiences, the silent understanding that came with fighting side by side. Tessa's abilities were nothing short of extraordinary, and Jace found himself relying on her more and more. She could sense enemy movements before they were even visible, could navigate the jungle with ease, and could read the subtle shifts in the atmosphere that often went unnoticed. Jace started to understand the depth of their bond. It wasn't just a connection forged by duty or circumstance. It was something deeper, something that neither of them had expected. Every time they faced danger together, every time Tessa saved him from an unseen threat, Jace felt a sense of gratitude that he couldn't quite put into words. It was as though, for the first time in his life, he wasn't fighting alone. One night, as they camped beneath the stars, Tessa spoke again. This time, her voice was different, more tentative, as though she was unsure of how Jace would respond. "Do you ever wonder, Jace, what life could be like without the constant fighting? Without the missions, the wars, just us living freely?" Jace stared at the stars above, their cold light piercing the vast darkness of space. He had never allowed himself to think about life beyond the battlefield. There was always something to fight for, always another mission, another enemy to defeat. But Tessa's words made him pause. Could he ever have a life beyond this? Could he ever stop being the soldier and become something more? "I don't know," he said quietly, his voice filled with uncertainty. "I've never really thought about it, but I'm not sure what else there is, Tessa. I've been fighting for so long." Tessa's voice was soft but steady. "You don't have to fight forever, Jace. You've already given so much. Maybe it's time to think about what you truly want." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had spent so much of his life fighting, surviving, that he had never really stopped to think about what he truly wanted. The idea of a life without war, without conflict, was alien to him. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that it wasn't an impossible dream. Maybe, just maybe, there was a future for him, a future where he wasn't just a soldier. But that future would require him to trust, to let go of the walls he had built around himself. It would require him to open up to Tessa, to embrace the bond they had formed. And for the first time in years, Jace felt a glimmer of hope. The mission continued, but Jace's thoughts were no longer entirely consumed by the objective. He still fought, still followed orders, but now there was something more at stake. Tessa was no longer just his companion. She was someone he couldn't imagine facing the future without. As the days turned into weeks, the bond between them continued to grow. It wasn't just about psychic abilities or shared danger. It was about understanding, trust, and the quiet moments in between the chaos. For the first time in a long time, Jace felt like he had found someone who truly understood him. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Whatever came next, Jace and Tessa would face it together. The mission had taken a dangerous turn. What had started as a simple sabotage operation now felt like a life-and-death struggle. As Jace and Tessa made their way deeper into enemy territory, the stakes grew higher. The Valorian forces had started to tighten their grip on the planet, and their military presence was growing stronger by the hour. Jace could feel it in the air, the tension, the fear, and the desperate need to finish the job before it was too late. The jungle that had once seemed like an obstacle now felt like a maze. Every step was calculated, every move carefully planned. The dense trees and thick vines that surrounded them acted like walls, trapping them in a maze of green. The oppressive humidity made it hard to breathe, and the constant sound of distant explosions in the background only reminded them of how high the stakes were. Tessa moved with effortless grace, her glowing violet markings lighting the way through the darkness. She was calm, her mind attuned to the world around her in a way that Jace couldn't fully understand. Her psychic abilities gave her an almost unnatural awareness of everything. The sounds of enemy movements, the slight shifts in the atmosphere, the very vibrations of the earth beneath their feet. It was like she could sense the entire battlefield without even looking. Jace, on the other hand, relied on his instincts. He had been trained to fight, to survive, and to lead. His senses were sharp, but they weren't as refined as Tessa's, and yet with every passing day he felt himself relying on her more and more. The bond between them was undeniable, even if it still made him uneasy. He had never let anyone get this close, never trusted anyone this much. But with Tessa, it felt different. Her presence was comforting, almost soothing, despite the chaos surrounding them. The deeper they went into the heart of the Valorian stronghold, the more they realized how much was at stake. The Valorians were not just building weapons, they were building a device capable of changing the very fabric of space. The implications of such a weapon were unimaginable. If it fell into the wrong hands, it could tear apart the galaxy itself. Jace couldn't let that happen. He couldn't let Tessa down. They reached a clearing where the shadows of the trees stretched long across the ground, and the soft rustle of the jungle faded into silence. Jace signaled for Tessa to halt, his mind racing. They had located the weapon's cache, but it was heavily guarded. The plan was simple: sabotage the weapons, destroy the device, and get out. But Jace knew it wouldn't be that easy. "We're getting close," Jace muttered under his breath. He adjusted the strap on his rifle, his eyes scanning the area. "You can feel them, can't you?" Tessa nodded, her expression unreadable. Her violet eyes glowed faintly in the darkness as she focused. "They're here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But they don't know we're coming." Jace trusted her, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. His hand instinctively went to the sidearm at his waist, ready for whatever came next. He couldn't afford to be distracted, not now, not when the fate of the galaxy rested on their shoulders. The quiet hum of distant machinery reached their ears, and Jace knew they were getting closer to the heart of the Valorian operation. They had to move quickly. They couldn't afford any mistakes. If they were caught, they would never make it out alive. They pressed forward, moving with the stealth of shadows. Tessa led the way, her every step light and calculated, as though she knew exactly where to go. Jace followed closely behind, his senses alert, his mind on high alert. The deeper they went, the more intense the energy around them became. The air felt thick, charged, as though the very fabric of reality was being twisted and reshaped by the Valorian technology. They reached a large steel door at the base of a massive facility. The door was heavily fortified and security was tight, but Tessa's abilities made the impossible seem simple. With a subtle gesture, she reached out with her psychic power and the door clicked open. No alarms, no guards, the entrance was theirs. Jace couldn't help but marvel at her abilities. She wasn't just a soldier, she was something else entirely. Her strength wasn't just in her physical form, but in her mind, in the way she could manipulate the world around her. He had never met anyone like her. In a strange way, it made him feel both small and empowered. She wasn't just his companion, she was his partner, his equal. Inside, they found the weapons cache, dozens of advanced devices lined up, each one more dangerous than the last. But it wasn't the weapons that caught Jace's attention. It was the device in the center of the room. It was a massive machine, pulsating with dark energy, its core glowing a sickly green. Jace's heart sank as he realized what it was. This wasn't just a weapon, it was the very thing that could destroy everything. "We have to destroy it," Jace said, his voice tense. He looked to Tessa for confirmation, but she was already moving, her eyes locked onto the device. There was no need for words between them. They both knew what had to be done. Tessa reached out, her hand glowing with psychic energy. She focused, her mind reaching out to the machine, trying to understand its inner workings. Jace watched as her face twisted in concentration. He could see the strain on her, the way her markings flickered brighter with each passing second. "I can't just disable it," Tessa said, her voice strained. "It's connected to the fabric of space itself. If I try to shut it down, it could tear apart everything around us." Jace's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a mission anymore. This was a race against time to prevent the universe from falling apart. "We don't have a choice," Jace said, his voice firm. "We destroy it no matter the cost." Tessa hesitated for a moment, her violet eyes meeting his. Then with a final nod, she reached out again, her psychic power surging. The machine began to shake, its core pulsating with a sickly green light. The air was thick with energy, and Jace could feel the ground tremble beneath him. They were running out of time. With a final push, Tessa's psychic energy surged through the machine, and for a moment everything went still. Jace held his breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion. But instead, the machine began to hum, a deep, low sound that resonated through the air. Tessa's face twisted in pain, her markings flickering wildly as she fought to hold the machine together. "It's not enough," she gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't do it alone." Jace's heart raced as he realized what she was asking. She wasn't just asking for help, she was offering him a part of herself. The bond they had formed, the connection between them, was the key to destroying the machine. They had to join forces, physically and mentally. Without thinking, Jace reached out and grasped Tessa's hand. The moment their skin touched, a surge of energy shot through him, more powerful than anything he had ever experienced. It was as though their minds and bodies merged, as if they were one entity, working together in perfect harmony. The machine began to hum louder, its energy growing unstable. The room shook, and Jace could feel the strain on his own body as Tessa's power poured into him, her psychic energy merging with his own. It was more than just a physical connection. It was a bond that transcended space and time, a connection that altered their very beings. And then, with a final, deafening roar, the machine exploded. The blast sent them flying across the room, and everything went black. The explosion was deafening. The shockwave of energy sent Jace and Tessa crashing to the ground, their bodies thrown against the walls of the weapons facility. For a moment, everything was a blur, smoke, fire, and the deafening roar of collapsing metal. Jace's ears rang, and his body ached from the force of the blast. He struggled to rise, his limbs heavy and uncooperative. "Jace!" Tessa's voice called out weakly, distant and faint. He blinked, trying to clear the haze from his vision, and saw her lying a few feet away, her glowing markings flickering erratically. "Tessa!" Jace scrambled to her side, his heart pounding in his chest. The explosion had thrown them both far from the core of the blast, but the shockwave had still taken its toll. Tessa was conscious, but barely. Her breathing was shallow, and her violet eyes were clouded with pain. I did it," she whispered, her voice strained. "The machine's gone, but it took everything I had." Jace's hand hovered over her, unsure of what to do. She had pushed herself to the limit, tapping into a power that even Jace couldn't fully comprehend. She had given everything to stop the weapon, to save the galaxy, and now she was paying the price. "You're going to be okay," Jace said, though his words felt hollow. He had no idea if she would be okay. He wasn't a healer, and the extent of her injuries was something beyond his experience. All he could do was hold her, pray that she would recover, and figure out how to get them out of this mess. "We have to leave," Tessa said, her voice trembling as she attempted to sit up. Her strength was failing, but her determination still burned brightly. "The Valorians, they know we're here. They'll come for us." Jace's mind snapped into focus. The mission wasn't over yet. In fact, it had only just become more dangerous. The explosion had taken down the machine, but it had also alerted the enemy to their presence. They had to get out before the Valorian forces descended on them. The last thing Jace wanted was to be trapped in this facility with nowhere to go. He helped Tessa to her feet, her body swaying with the effort. She leaned against him for support, but her mind was still sharp. Despite her injuries, she was determined to keep moving. She wasn't going to let this defeat them, not after everything they had been through. "We'll make it out," Jace said, though he wasn't sure if he was convincing her or himself. He had never been good at facing odds this impossible. But with Tessa by his side, he felt something different, something that made him believe they could do it. The facility was in chaos. The explosion had triggered alarms, and the sounds of Valorian soldiers rushing to the scene filled the air. Jace's heart raced. Every second counted. They had to move, and they had to move fast. Tessa's hand was still clutching his, and as they moved through the corridors, Jace couldn't help but feel the weight of their connection. Her psychic abilities were weakening, but she still seemed to sense everything around them. She led them through the winding hallways, avoiding enemy patrols with an ease that amazed Jace. Every step, every turn was guided by her intuition. "We're almost there," she whispered. "Just a little farther." Jace nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. The Valorian forces would be coming from every direction. They needed an escape route, and they needed it now. The shuttle they had arrived in was too far away to be a viable option, and the facility was surrounded by enemy forces. Their options were running out, and fast. They reached a dead end. A door, heavily fortified and locked, stood in front of them. Jace's heart sank as he realized that their only exit was blocked. He turned to Tessa, but she was already looking at the door, her face set in concentration. "I can't hold them off much longer," she said, her voice soft but filled with determination. "You have to get to the shuttle. I'll hold them off." Jace shook his head, refusing to leave her behind. "We're getting out of here together," he said firmly. "I'm not going without you." For a moment, Tessa looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if weighing his words. Then, with a sigh, she nodded. "Fine," she said quietly, "but we'll have to move fast." Tessa reached out, her psychic abilities flickering as she tried to sense the enemy's movements. Her markings glowed faintly as she connected with the facility's energy systems. The door in front of them began to hum as Tessa manipulated the controls from a distance, using her powers to break through the lock. Jace could hear the soldiers outside, their footsteps growing louder with every passing second. They didn't have much time. With a final burst of energy, the door clicked open, and Tessa stumbled forward, her strength finally giving way. Jace caught her before she fell, his arms steady and firm around her. "Let's go," he said urgently, pulling her along. They raced through the narrow passageway, their footsteps echoing off the walls. The sound of Valorian soldiers shouting grew louder, and Jace knew they were getting closer. There was no turning back now. They had to make it to the shuttle, and they had to do it fast. Suddenly, the sound of gunfire erupted behind them. Jace's heart skipped a beat as the first shots rang out, the harsh noise shattering the silence. The Valorians had found them. "We're almost there," Jace shouted, adrenaline flooding his veins as he pulled Tessa along. She was barely able to keep up, her body weakening with every step. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Another burst of gunfire hit the wall beside them, sending debris flying. Jace dove to the side, pulling Tessa with him to avoid the next volley of shots. He could feel the heat of the explosion as it rocked the facility around them. They were running out of time. Finally, they reached the end of the hall. The shuttle was just ahead, its sleek form gleaming in the dim light. But as they ran toward it, they saw a group of Valorian soldiers blocking their path. Jace's heart sank. They were trapped. There was no way around them. The only option left was to fight. "Stay behind me," Jace ordered, his voice steady even though his pulse raced. He drew his weapon, his mind calculating his next move. Tessa's hand was still in his, her grip weak but firm. "No," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We fight together." Jace turned to her, surprised. She was weak, too weak to fight. But her determination was unwavering. She was ready to face whatever came their way. With a deep breath, Jace nodded. He had no other choice. They were in this together. They stood side by side, their backs against the shuttle, ready for the fight of their lives. The Valorians were closing in, and Jace knew this was the final stand. It wasn't just about completing the mission anymore. It was about survival. The first soldier came into view, his weapon raised. Jace fired first, taking him down in a single shot. But there were more coming, and they were closing in fast. Jace and Tessa fought back to back, their bond stronger than ever as they held their ground. Every shot, every movement was a testament to their unity. They were no longer just soldier and companion. They were a force to be reckoned with. But as the last of the soldiers fell, Jace's eyes turned to Tessa. She was pale, her body trembling from the exertion. She had pushed herself too far. "We're done," he said, breathless but relieved. "We're getting out of here." With the last of their strength, they boarded the shuttle. The engines roared to life and they blasted off into the sky, leaving the burning wreckage of the facility behind them. The mission was over. But as Jace looked at Tessa, he realized that everything had changed. They hadn't just destroyed a weapon, they had altered their fate. And whatever the future held, they would face it together. The shuttle raced through the thick atmosphere of Verles, tearing through the night sky like a streak of light. Below, the planet was a blur, its surface dark and scarred from years of war. But above, in the empty void of space, Jace and Tessa were finally free. The tension of the past few days, the chaos of their mission, and the weight of their survival were still heavy on their minds. But for the first time in what felt like forever, they were headed toward something new. Jace sat at the controls of the shuttle, his hands steady as he guided them toward the safety of the orbiting ship waiting for them. The hum of the engines was a comforting sound, a reminder that they had made it out. But even as they ascended into the stars, Jace's mind was still on the mission, and on Tessa. She was seated beside him, her face pale and drawn from the exertion of the fight, her energy drained by the immense psychic effort she had put into disabling the Valorian weapon. Her glowing markings had dimmed, and she looked far more fragile than the powerful figure Jace had come to rely on. Still, there was a quiet strength in her eyes, an unspoken resilience that made Jace realize just how much she had sacrificed. "We did it," Jace said, his voice soft but filled with a mixture of relief and disbelief. He couldn't believe it was over. He couldn't believe they had actually destroyed the weapon and escaped. Tessa nodded, but she didn't speak right away. Instead, she stared out the window at the vastness of space, her thoughts lost somewhere in the depths of the galaxy. For a long moment, neither of them said anything, each of them lost in their own reflection. Jace had always been a soldier, a man of action and purpose. But now, as they drifted away from Verles, he couldn't help but wonder what came next. He had lived his life on the front lines, in constant conflict, never allowing himself to think beyond the next mission. But with Tessa by his side, everything felt different. She had become more than just a companion. She was someone he trusted, someone who had shown him a different way to look at the world. Tessa turned her gaze to him, sensing his thoughts. She could always tell when he was troubled, and she knew that the battle wasn't just over for them. It was just the beginning of something new. The bond between them had changed the way they saw everything. The mission had started as a simple objective, but it had turned into a journey of self-discovery, of facing their fears and learning to trust each other in ways neither of them had ever imagined. "I don't think I could have done it without you," Jace said, his voice quieter now, vulnerable in a way he wasn't used to. You saved me more times than I can count. You were always there when I needed you most." Tessa smiled faintly, her violet eyes softening. "And you saved me too," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We saved each other, that's what we do." Jace turned to look at her, his heart swelling with a strange mixture of gratitude and awe. "I didn't think it would end like this," he admitted. "I thought I'd be a soldier forever, but now, I don't know what comes next." "You don't have to be a soldier forever," Tessa said, her voice steady and reassuring. "You've given so much already. Maybe it's time to think about what you want, not just what's expected of you." Jace glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "And what about you? What do you want?" Tessa looked away, her gaze drifting toward the stars outside the shuttle. "I want to find peace," she said, almost to herself. "I've lived my whole life in service to others, first to my people, then to the mission. I've never really had the chance to choose for myself." Jace understood. She was a warrior just like him, and she had spent so much of her life doing what was asked of her. They both had. But now the war was over, and they were both left standing at the crossroads of something new. Neither of them knew exactly what that would look like, but they knew they couldn't go back to the way things were. As the shuttle climbed higher into space, Jace's mind raced. He couldn't help but think about the future, about what life could be like without constant battles, without the weight of responsibility hanging over him every day. He had always believed that being a soldier was his purpose, that it was all he was meant to do. But now, with Tessa beside him, he was starting to realize that maybe there was more to life than just fighting. The shuttle shook slightly as it passed through the last layer of the atmosphere, and Jace tightened his grip on the controls. They were almost out of danger. Almost home, but even as they approached the safety of the command ship, Jace felt a sense of unease, a nagging question he couldn't shake. What now? What did they do next? We'll figure it out, Tessa said, sensing his thoughts once again. One step at a time. Jace nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure how to begin. He had spent so many years focused on the mission that he hadn't allowed himself to think about what he wanted. What did he want? To live a quiet life, to fight again, to explore the galaxy, free from the constraints of war. The truth was, he didn't know, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid to find out. The shuttle docked with the orbiting command ship with a soft thud, and the hatch opened to reveal the bustling activity of the ship's crew. They were greeted as heroes, their successful mission and escape from the Valorian stronghold met with applause and cheers. But as Jace and Tessa stepped off the shuttle, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They had saved the galaxy, but they had also changed everything for themselves. The officers and crew members congratulated them, but Jace and Tessa barely heard the words. Their minds were elsewhere, on the journey they had just completed and the one that was still ahead of them. "You know," Jace said as they made their way down the corridor, "I never thought I'd be standing here with you. I didn't think I'd ever find someone I could trust this much." Tessa smiled, a faint hint of sadness in her expression. "I never thought I'd find someone like you either, Jace, but I think that's what makes this bond so powerful. It wasn't expected and it wasn't planned. It just happened." They stopped at the window of the ship, looking out at the vastness of space. The stars stretched out before them, infinite and full of possibility. For the first time in a long time, Jace didn't feel lost. He didn't feel like a soldier on a mission. He felt like someone with a future that was no longer defined by war and conflict. "I think we have a lot to figure out," Jace said, his voice steady, "but I don't want to do it alone. I want to do it with you." Tessa's smile grew, and she reached out to take his hand. "We'll figure it out together, Jace. Whatever comes next, we face it side by side." For the first time, Jace felt a sense of peace. He didn't know what the future held, but with Tessa by his side, he knew they could handle whatever came their way. Together, they were unstoppable. Together, they could find a new purpose. And for the first time in his life, Jace wasn't afraid to believe in something beyond the mission.